Across the course of the sessions, you'll hear from a range of people. We've got academics, we've got campaigners, policymakers, some people in business, and people from within Lambeth, from the community, who are working at community level on some of the issues that you're going to be discussing. Okay, so I'm going to check my notes that I've not missed anything in whizzing through all of that. And if I haven't, then we'll go to listen to Alice. Okay, yeah, so Alice is our first speaker from the charity Possible, and she'll be talking to us about what climate change is, some of the kind of basics of that, why we should care about it, why we're now calling it a climate crisis, and what are the things that, you know, that are happening to try and address it, but kind of at a high level. So Alice will now share her slides. If I stop sharing mine, let's see if that part of the technology works. Seamless, great. Okay, so Alice, over to you. We're on mute, Alice. First one of the night, well done, that's good. I should say, by the way, folks, if
I'm used to this by now.
If you look at view in the top corner of your screen, you'll have options for speaker view, gallery view. So if you want to see Alice in big screen, go speaker view and you'll just see her face. If you want to see everybody else, then choose gallery view. It's up to you. But anyway, Alice, over to you.
Right, you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Sorry. Hello, it's really lovely to be invited to be part of this. I am a campaigner. I've got the name of my organisation up there in our beautiful bright pink and purple. We're Possible. We're a climate charity that work across the UK on solutions for taking action, things that we can do to take action on climate change, not just talking about how it's a problem, but how we can take action to do something about it. I also used to be an academic in Imperial, like Neil, and I was a journalist, and I've always specialised in the intersection between kind of science and technology and the environment. But I'm also a Londoner. I don't currently live in Lambeth. I live in Southwark, just next door, but I went for a walk in Lambeth just about an hour ago while I was prepping for this talk. I go through Lambeth a lot, and I've been seeing the signs up about the Climate Assembly, and I've been kind of excited to know what's going to come out of it. So it's really lovely to be part of it. And I did used to live in Lambeth. In fact, my granddad is from Lambeth as well. I have long-standing roots there, so I really care about the borough. Like probably a lot of you, I have lived my entire life with the threat of climate change kind of just there. Now, I didn't always think about it. I didn't always worry about it. I didn't always pay that much attention to it, but it was always there. Now, I'm getting on a bit. I could put it this way, you know, I had my jab a few weeks ago. You can probably work out my age from that, but so is climate change. Climate change is getting on a bit. It's been a problem for quite a while. You don't have to be a teenage youth striker to have lived your entire life with that kind of just there. And even for those of you who haven't lived your entire life with it, it's been there for decades. People have been talking about it for decades. In fact, I spent the last couple of years writing a book about the history of the climate crisis because I was interested in kind of how long people have been worrying about it and how we kind of got into this mess. And one of the things I realized is that we first kind of discovered the link between carbon dioxide and global warming in 1856. It's 1856, a woman called Eunice Foote, an American scientist and women's rights activist living in New York State. She was just doing some science at home. She didn't have a lab. She wasn't a professional scientist. It was kind of a side hobby for her. And she was doing some science at home, and she collected together different gases and put them on her windowsill to see how well they trapped heat. And she realized that carbon dioxide trapped heat really, really well. And by then, other scientists had kind of developed the idea of what we now call the greenhouse effect. They realized that space was really cold and the Earth wasn't that cold. So there must be something that was keeping us warm. And they worked out there was this sort of insulating blanket of gases. So you probably remember this from GCSE science as sort of insulating of gases, which we now call greenhouse gases or the greenhouse effect, that kind of keeps us a bit warm. And she worked out that if that mix of gases had lots of carbon dioxide in it, in theory, the Earth would get really hot. And she put in her paper, an atmosphere heavy in carbon dioxide would create a very hot climate. And she thought this was just theory. Now, with the advantages of modern science, we know that by the 1850s, humans were already warming the earth by burning fossil fuels through their carbon emissions. We'd started to burn coal, particularly in the UK around the time of Shakespeare, and kind of more and more intensely. And then with the invention of the steam engine at the end of the 18th century, we started to build factories and then ships and trains all powered by coal. We then started to, a bit after Eunice Foote in the kind of later 1850s, started to dig for oil and find ways to burn, reasons to burn oil too. We were burning loads of coal to heat our homes, to make gas as well. You've probably seen, some of you might live near that development around Oval with the old gasometers. It's where they used to burn huge amounts of coal to make gas to light and heat our homes. And by the 1850s, we were already warming the earth with these kind of emissions. But she didn't know that. So Eunice Foote in the 1850s, it was just theory. And it wasn't until 1956, a whole 100 years later, that scientists really started worrying about the carbon emissions and how they might be causing climate change. And with more money that was available to scientists at the time and new ideas, they started to think this is something we should take action on, that we should do some more research on. It can't just be left for a woman whose hobby is looking at gases on a windowsill. It has to be something we do seriously. A man called Roger Ravel, who was another American scientist, this time working on the West Coast in California, he first briefed the American Congress in 1956 about this problem. So when people talk about, oh, American politicians are finally taking action on climate change, well, they were first briefed on it in 1956. Just to say a little bit about sort of 100 years. So in 1856, Eunice had sort of said, oh, there's this link, and no one paid much attention to her, possibly because she was a woman. But luckily, a couple of years later, in sort of 1958, a man came along and said exactly the same thing, and people did listen to him. His name is Tyndall. So Neil, who you'll hear from in a minute, he did his PhD at the Tyndall Centre, which is named after this man Tyndall. And he's often credited as how first really establishing that link between carbon dioxide and global warming. We now know that Eunice Foote did it first. Some people think he copied her, but I think that's a bit unfair. He probably should have listened to her. He wasn't big on reading science by women. We should criticise him for that, but I don't think he copied her. Anyway, he established that link sort of in mainstream science. Lots of people cited it. Kind of, again, they still thought it was theoretical. A guy called Arrhenius, who was a Swedish scientist, who for trivia fans is also a relative of Greta Thunberg, the youth striker. This time around the sort of 1890s, turn of the century, he worked with some other scientists in Sweden, and they started to think, maybe we are producing a lot of carbon dioxide. Maybe all this coal burning might heat the planet. Up until then, it had just been theory. They'd be like, oh yeah, carbon dioxide could heat the planet. They didn't think, there's all these batteries everywhere. They didn't really make that link going, we might do this ourselves. But Arrhenius did that around the 1890s. But he still thought it would be the future. He thought it would be centuries before anyone would notice something. And it wasn't until 1938 that this guy, Guy Callender, who's another person working just as a side project, as a hobby. His day job was as an engineer burning lots of coal and petrol actually for the electricity industry. But his hobby was doing maths with weather. He had an unusual hobby. And he worked out using weather records that in his lifetime, so this would have been for the beginning of the 20th century, that the Earth had already warmed by a whole third of a degree Celsius. And he linked that to the carbon dioxide emissions. He said, look, we've known the theory of this for years. We thought it was something that was going to happen in the future, but it's already happening. And this was just before the war in 1938. Initially, he was sort of laughed out the room, but what would eventually happen after the war in the 40s is that people would pick it up and do some more research. And by 1956, this guy, Roger Ravel, could brief Congress and go, like, this is something we need some money for. And Roger Ravel, one of the things he got some money for was this thing, which is an observatory on the top of a volcano in Hawaii.
Alex, can I just check? Were you trying to share your slides, or were you? I wanted to make sure you weren't trying to share them, were you? Because we couldn't see them.
Oh, could you not see them? Oh, I thought you had pictures of these people.
Sorry, it occurred to me as you're speaking.
So sorry.
Sorry. It's sort of fascinating, so it's fine. But if you want to share them now, we can.
I was looking at the slides, not at you. Can you see them now?
Yeah, that's fine. You can see it now. We missed the faces, so you can show us their faces.
They're not very interesting men. They're old white men. With one of them had a really good beard. This is an observatory at the top of a mountain in Hawaii, volcano in Hawaii, where it's a really good place to be to be measuring carbon dioxide levels, because it's up the top of a volcano in Hawaii. It's very pure. You don't get anything kind of messing with the data like air pollution from cars, although there is a car in that picture, which is probably messing with the data very slightly. And Roger Ravel got some money together to build this centre to be measuring the carbon dioxide levels. And this is a famous graph, which if anyone who's ever studied climate science will probably know very well, which is a graph from that data centre that collects how much carbon dioxide there is at this Mauna Loa observatory, and has been doing from the late 50s. And it's amazing, it's a bit of scientific research that's been running that long. It's really, really rare for scientific research to run that long. You know, Neil's colleagues at Imperial will be happy if they manage to get a research project to last 5 years, let alone this number of decades. You know, this is almost a lifetime. And you can see it's got this wiggly line going up and down, and this is the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere over all this time, and it goes up and down because that is with the seasons. It's in the northern hemisphere, or the forests in their summer, they breathe in lots of carbon dioxide, because as we learn at school, plants breathe in carbon dioxide, and then as they die back in the autumn and the winter, they breathe it out. And so that wiggly line is the earth breathing, but you can see that the larger trend, as well as it going up and down, is that the levels of carbon dioxide are going up. And so through these decades, this research project kept going. Lots of other research projects started. More and more scientists did more and more work, asking more and more questions about this, because you know, it's one thing, you know, measuring the carbon dioxide, and some people have having done some clever studies of carbon dioxide in some bottles in the 1850s. But, you know, you're talking about something really serious. You need to do an awful lot of research to look at it from lots of different directions. And by the 1980s, there was kind of what we'd call a consensus within the scientific community, or particularly people in the scientific community of the area that studied this, to say, yes, global warming is happening, it's really, really serious, and it's something we need to tackle. And when Roger Ravel in the 1950s, this guy who first briefed Congress, he figured back then, oh, we'd all move over to nuclear anyway. Fossil fuels were kind of a bit of a weird thing anyway. We probably shouldn't be doing that. And that it would only be a momentary blip. He didn't think that these levels were going to keep rising all this time. But the 1980s, not only had they amassed so much more knowledge about it, but they'd also seen that in 30 years, no one had swapped over from fossil fuels. Nuclear hadn't come and saved them, and there was more that needed to be done. So various politicians, including this woman, who some of you will recognise, not always necessarily that popular in Lambeth, but she was a trained scientist, and she also appreciated that Britain was doing quite a lot of key research in climate science. And so she appreciated that talking about climate change was going to be something that was going to be she felt it was going to dominate global politics for decades to come. She could see the enormity of it, and she knew that she needed to get in there and frame it in the political way that she wanted to see it. She argued that we needed to tackle it using the market, because that was very much her political philosophy, but also she saw it as an opportunity to show off how great British science was. So she gave a couple of speeches which go on about how great British science is, and also talks about the importance for action on climate change. And she was one of several politicians in the late 80s that were calling for a global agreement, a bit like the ones we have on things like nuclear weapons, about climate action. And this was on the run up to something called the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. So this is Boutros Ghali, who was in charge of the UN back then, at the Rio talks, which was the talks where they kicked off having a global agreement on climate change, and they formed something called the UN Framework on Climate Change. And this they made some kind of vague agreements of what they would do, but nothing really, really tight. But what they also importantly did was they agreed that they keep meeting every year. And since then, everyone who signed this contract, this treaty, which is basically all the countries in the world, will meet at the end of every year and have big climate talks. And every few years, they have really, really big ones. And that's what's happening in Glasgow at the end of this year. The ones that were meant to happen last year, but got postponed because of COVID. They're the really big talks on climate change. And the normal ones happen every year, but we're having bumper ones, and the Glasgow ones are some of the bumper ones. And he said, this is the first of the bumper climate talks. He said, back in 1992, when some of you won't have been alive, and some of you, like me, would have been quite young then, if we do nothing, the storm will break on the heads of future generations. For them, it will be too late. Now, I find it really moving I come back to this quote every now and again, and I find it really moving because he said this in 1992. Those future generations that he's talking about are here now. Those storms that he is talking about are here now. They are storms that we are living through. And in the UK, we are pretty protected from a lot of those storms, partly because we have things like the Thames Barrier, because we're rich enough to have stuff like that, but also because just where we happen to be in the planet geographically, actually we're a bit lucky. Despite the fact that we arguably caused a lot of this problem by kicking off the Industrial Revolution, we managed to escape some of the worst impacts of it. But there are all sorts of storms. There are storms, you know, rainstorms, windstorms, things like hurricanes, also things like you might have read in the news in the last couple of years, there's been huge storms of locusts. And there are lots of reasons for that. But one of them is climate change. It makes it more likely to have these big swarms of locusts. And what they do is they eat people's crops. And it's one of the real dangers of climate change is that it can endanger people's food supply. So yeah, this is, I think, a really important quote because it just reminds us that people were worried about this in the 90s and we are now living that kind of horror story that they talked about back then. So these talks rolled on. These are the 1997 ones in Kyoto. Some of you might remember those. There's a big picture of Al Gore chatting there. And they kind of agreed in Kyoto they'd do a bit more, but again, they didn't really make any tight agreements. And then W. Bush came in and he took America out of Kyoto. But then the year 2000 happened. And for decades, people like Roger Ravel have been saying, if we don't do anything, by the year 2000, things are going to get bad. And then they did. We started to feel those impacts. All of us will have experience slightly weird weather, and even if we don't personally identify it as climate change, I bet one of your friends has gone, oh yeah, that's that global warming. Something that we now as citizens of the 21st century are quite used to, I think, this sense of weird weather happening and weather being a bit more dangerous because of it. So that picture there is Katrina from 2005, which we know is likely to have been a lot heavier because more damaging because of climate change. These storms have happened in America always. It's a big part of American weather experiences. It's one of the reasons why there are so many great weather scientists in America, because they study these storms, but they are harder and they're faster and they're more frequent because of climate change. There's also things like big heat waves. We had a really big heat wave in Europe in 2003 where loads of people died, particularly in France. People were more and more aware of that and started to feel like they needed to take action. And there was a real wave of call for more and more climate action in the mid-noughties around this period. And this led to a really groundbreaking bit of climate action from, believe it or not, the UK government. Now, I am a professional climate campaigner and it is my job to talk about how terrible the UK government is on climate change, which is totally true most of the time. However, we should acknowledge that they have done some really world-leading stuff, including the Climate Change Act of 2008. And what they did, while other countries were like, oh yeah, we can get away with doing nothing, they said, no, we're going to go back to this Kyoto Agreement and we're going to actually take action. We're not just going to say, oh, we want to do it. We're actually going to do it. We're going to make this legally binding and we're going to pass this act that's going to say that we're going to cut our carbon emissions by 80% from what they were in 1990 by 2050. And lots of other countries, you know, they took our lead. You know, sometimes people in the UK are like, oh, it doesn't really matter what we do. This tiny little island that's a bit up itself thinks it's more important than it is. Actually, we know, we did the Climate Change Act and other countries were like, oh, we should do this too. And we had an impact. This was on the run up to another set of these bumper climate talks, this time in Copenhagen. And lots of people were like, right, yeah, we had Katrina. Lots of people are worried about climate change. Obama is the president of America. George W. Bush has left. We can have action on climate change. And there was a lot of hope on the run up to these talks. People thought, oh, we're going to finally have action. So we really see Obama there. He's sitting next to Gordon Brown with Merkel in the pink and Sarkozy from France just next to him. And they had a lot of chats at Copenhagen and they came up with pretty much nothing. They ended up with this very loose agreement between America and China that they would try and keep to around 2 degrees warming, but they weren't going to say how they were going to do it or when they were going to do it. And people were very disappointed. They felt quite deflated by this. But climate movement kind of picked itself up again. Right, we need to fight for the ambition we had before and get back, and we need to start to start acting on it. It's getting too late. And by the time the Paris talks came around in 2015, so only 6 years ago, there was a lot more ambition. There was a lot more sense that we can do something and we have to do something. And the vital thing that happened in the Paris talks was they took this kind of loose chat about maybe trying to keep to 2 degrees warming, and they recognized that that was just too dangerous. I mean, 2 degrees warming is devastating. It's seriously dangerous. And they recognized that and they said, right, we need to keep to 1.5. And they agreed that they were going to try and keep to 1.5 global warming. Now, these numbers might seem quite small, like the difference between 1.5 or 2 degrees. You're like, what's that? That's like, it was like 2 degrees warmer earlier today. What they mean is they're an average of the global temperature for the whole year of the whole world. So they take all the temperature measurements from all the different parts of the world, they put them together for the whole year, and they work out the average. And they compare it to what the temperatures were like back when Eunice Foote in the 1850s was alive, before we really started to burn lots of oil and coal at scale. And it's kind of a bit arbitrary, Celsius is just the scale that humans use to measure temperature, and we do that because we like counting in tens because we've got 10 fingers, and we work our scale of Celsius is based on water, because it's 0 is when it freezes and 100 is when it boils, because we like playing with water and making ourselves cups of tea. It's a little bit arbitrary. It's kind of these patterns that humans put on the world to help them understand it, but these patterns are useful. They help us understand it, and these numbers help us have conversations about it. Just to give you a sense of what might seem like a small difference of these average temperatures, because they're these whole average temperatures, they actually mask really big differences. They mask big events like a hurricane picking up a lot more speed and a lot more power, about things like temperature changes which gradually encourage the populations of locusts to grow. They hide all of that, they smooth it out to this average. But the kind of difference between 2 degrees and 1.5 warming is the difference between having, at 2 degrees, we basically won't have any more coral reefs left at all in the world. They will all die. At 1.5, we can maybe keep 70% of them. Now that might seem like, for some of you might be thinking, yeah, like coral reef is nice, but I don't need it. Well, millions of people around the world live off the coral reefs. Lots of other animals also live off the coral reefs, and people live off those animals. It will be devastating to huge populations if they go, as well as losing something that is legitimately one of the beautiful things in the world. But also the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is a difference in tens of millions of people who will be displaced or killed because of floods or extra or of like heat waves. And so it's really important that we try and keep to, we don't just say, like they did at Copenhagen, like Obama and the Chinese premier said that 2 degrees will be all right, we'll cope, because we won't cope, or most of us won't cope. It will be, people say that even at 1.5 degrees is a death sentence on tens of millions of people around the world. And, it is true. I've got one of the notes I've got is that at 1.5 degrees, 14% of the global population would face a severe heat wave every 5 years, and 50% of us in the world would have it every 20 years. So that's a really severe heat wave, like the one that happened in 2003, where lots of people in France died. And at 2 degrees, that would be near a third of the population would have it every 5 years, and 70% of the global population, 70% of all of the people in the world would suffer a severe heat wave every 20 years. And that's the difference. And that's why we want to keep to as low as possible. So Britain, again, weirdly being leaders, great, decided that they would take this lead from Paris, and they would update their world leading climate change act, and they would go zero by 2050. They're not going to have just this 80% reduction, they're going to go zero. And this is where we talk about net zero emissions, and this came into law in 2019. Now the net zero in this acknowledges that we might have to burn a little bit of carbon to do some small things that we really need to burn some carbon for. But we would offset that by doing some other stuff, particularly technologies that could remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, these are really controversial because lots of people say, we're going to rely on this net too much and it becomes really slippery. And this is something I'm sure you'll discuss a lot more in detail as you run through your Citizens' Assembly. But it's still a big change from what was already world leading legislation. Britain upped their game, and again, lots of other countries followed us. So here is our minister signing the net zero legislation, and he's saying the UK kickstarted the Industrial Revolution. He's saying like this is a good thing, which we might argue about. He says, today we are leading the world yet again, and much as I would like to criticise the UK government on their climate policy, and I will at length, he's right, we did lead the world on this. So where are we right now, just to finish? We are, that volcano observatory that I showed you earlier, their latest data says that we're at 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide. So that means for every million bits of carbon dioxide, of atmosphere, for every million bits of atmosphere, there are a bit over 417, bit over 400 parts of it are carbon dioxide. Now that might not seem very much, but that is a big increase to what it was back in Eunice Foote's time. It's a big increase even for what it was from Roger Ravel's time when he launched this project in the 1950s. And it's enough to have created a temperature change of, well, from last year of just over 1 degree Celsius. So if we know the difference between just half a degree of 0.5 to 2 is tens of millions of people dying, already living at over 1 degree Celsius it is quite dangerous. And we already know that because, you know, we're living through it. We've seen the reports of drought or of floods and of the long-term impacts of that. Now, there was news just out today about how we should expect to hit 1.5 degrees in the next few years. Now, we won't notice that straight away. You know, these weird arbitrary scales that people have for measuring temperature. It's not like we hit 1.5 and then some wizard comes from the sky and goes, bang, climate change is bad. It happens over time. It takes a while for the glaciers to melt and so the sea level to rise and for islands to disappear. But it will happen a few years into living at 1.5, and we will start to see the sea level rise more and more, just as we have already started to see it rise more and more and more with the 1 degree that we're living with. The other thing we'll notice is a few years of drought will really start to have an impact. Already in parts of the world, places like Bangladesh, where there's been lots of flooding. It's not just one flood, which is really disruptive. If any of you have ever suffered flooding, it's a really horrible experience in itself. But when it happens again and again and again, it also leaves the land full of salt, which means that the farmers can't grow food, which means people have to move. And these things just keep gradually pulling us up. It's a bit like, you know, we're pretty exhausted after a whole year of living through COVID. Well, we're going to be even more exhausted after several decades of living at 1.5. And that is something that we are now living with. So, you know, we've known about the threat of climate change in theory since the 1850s. We've known about it seriously since the 1950s. And now, because of decades of largely inaction, we are in a position where we have to transform our economy radically, incredibly fast. If we had started in the 1980s when Thatcher was talking about it, it would have been a much easier process. We could have done it slower and we wouldn't have had so much to do. Sometimes people talk about climate change action as our generation's moonshot when they want to inspire us. They say, it's like putting a man on the moon. Climate change is nothing like putting a man on the moon. First of all, it's boring and it's miserable and it involves a lot of really awful weather. But also, it's just so much bigger than that. You know, putting a man on the moon is nothing compared to what we have to do. And we have to do this super fast, and we have to do all of this while living with this over a degree of global warming. So we also have to be protecting ourselves. And that's the challenge that you have as the Citizens Assembly for Lambeth, is thinking about what, as people of Lambeth, can you do to help transform the lives, you know, your lives and the lives of the people around you as rapidly as possible in a way that is still fair and is still safe and is still just, and also protects us from this climate change that we're already going to be living with. So we have to prevent as much as we can as possible that might happen. We have to prevent as much warming as possible, but also we have to live with the warming that we've got, and that is no easy thing to do. We've been left a really awful mess by our ancestors. I think we need to acknowledge that. But at the same time, this is my hopeful bit, we have been left a lot of opportunities. We've been left this knowledge that it is happening, because we might not, it's not obvious. We could be sitting around going, oh, the weather's a bit weird today. But we've been left this science that gives us this warning. And we've also been left, you know, loads of incredible technologies that will help us get out of it. And that's what Neil can talk to you a bit more about. Because, you know, all this time while we've been burning all this carbon and talking about climate change, we have also been getting on with stuff. We've been building things like the Climate Change Act, been inventing amazing things like solar panels. And we have got many of the means that we need to tackle it. So although I feel that it's really important that we all acknowledge how awful it is and what a difficult situation we're in, we should also remember that we have a lot of opportunities, and that you, as a community of people in Lambeth, have the opportunity to seize those opportunities. And in many ways, you've actually got something quite exciting to do.
That's great. Thank you, Alice, so much for kicking us off with that. And we've had some questions in the chat while you were talking, so you might want to have a look at those. We won't come